Isaiah chapter 8, if you want to turn there, Isaiah 8, and we will jump right in here this morning, Isaiah chapter 8. Actually, if you want to look at just a few verses back, we will be taking a look at chapter 7, last week's lesson, just a little bit, maybe before we get too far into this week's lesson. So we are really, chapter 8 is part of the events that took place in chapter 7 and kind of a further unpacking of what God said to Ahaz, King Ahaz. Look at chapter 7 and verse 14. This is the verse that most of us are pretty familiar with. I'm not going to reteach it, make a few comments about it, but God says, therefore, the Lord himself, this is Isaiah speaking to King Ahaz, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So I just want to remind you, I kind of drew a map up here again. I don't know if you still have your map left from last week, um, but I'll just scoot this over for just a minute or two. So we are in the time frame of about 734, 735 BC, and it's about 13 years before Assyria is going to march down to Israel, and they are going to take over Israel, the northern kingdom, and Samaria. That's going to happen in 722 BC. So this prophecy that we're reading today is about 735 or 734 BC. Now, in 732 BC, so in just a couple years after this, Assyria is actually going to come down to Damascus, which is the capital city of Syria, and they will take them over first. 732, 10 years later, they will take over Israel and Samaria. And of course, down here is Judah, capital city is Jerusalem. And Isaiah is prophesying to Judah primarily, but also to Israel, the north and southern kingdoms. So that's kind of the time frame. Hopefully, you remembered the map from last week and don't have to depend on my scratching out. But that just kind of gives you a little context of where we are at. The invasion is going to be first Syria, then Israel, and that invasion will be led by TP3, Tiglath-Pileser III, who is the Assyrian king. And so as we talked about last week, all of this was happening. Assyria is getting stronger. They're knocking on the door of Syria. They are threatening Israel. And Judah, a little further south, is starting to get a little nervous because this world power, Assyria, is growing greater and greater. So as we looked at last week, if you remember, the kings of Israel and Syria were trying to get the king of Judah, who was Ahaz, to join in an alliance with them so that they could better defend themselves against Assyria. And Isaiah comes and says to Ahaz, you don't need to make an alliance with them. You can trust me. And he says to Ahaz, what they're really planning on doing, this is Isaiah talking to the king of Judah, and he says, what these two nations are really wanting to do is they're wanting you to sign on the dotted line and join an alliance with you, and then they're going to kick you out. And they're going to replace you with their own king, Tabeel, and he would not be in the line of David. And so this whole thing where this is supposed to be an ancestor of David would have been messed up. And Isaiah says to King Ahaz, you don't need to fear. As a matter of fact, look at chapter 7, verse 7, 8, and 9. This is last week's lesson. Thus saith the Lord God, he's talking to King Ahaz, it shall not stand. These two nations, don't worry about them, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years, Ephraim, will be broken. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. And then he says, this is the part I want you to get. Isaiah says to King Ahaz, if you will not believe, surely you will not be established. In other words, Ahaz, God's going to take care of Judah no matter what. You just need to decide which team you're going to be on. If you stay on God's side, you'll be okay. But if you don't believe, you're not going to be established either. So that was all part of what we talked about last week. And that's when then Isaiah says to King Ahaz, if you don't believe, if you're struggling to believe, ask God for a sign. That's in verse 10. Ask God for anything. And he actually says, as high as you want to go, as deep as you want to go, ask God for anything. And you remember what Ahaz said? Ahaz said, well, I'm not going to tempt God, so I don't want to ask God for a sign. But God had told him to ask for a sign. And so Isaiah said, well, he rebukes him. And he says, God's going to give you a sign anyway. Not going to help you, but he's going to give you a sign anyway. And that was the sign of the virgin birth. A virgin shall conceive and is going to bring forth a son, going to call his name Emmanuel. Now, we talked about what that meant last week, and I'll only say it or state it. Don't have time to reteach it. But simply what God was saying is the attempt of Syria and Israel to replace Ahaz was not going to work. God was going to keep the Davidic, the line of David, that dynasty on the throne, and he would keep that line all the way until we get to the Gospels, and this virgin conceives, Mary, who gives birth to a son who is of the line of David, right? And so God's going to confirm himself, and he would be born into a time when the Jews were under oppression to Rome. All of that we unpacked last week. Now, then there was this little side prophecy in the short term, and again, this is just review of last week. In the short term, Isaiah's son, Shear Jashub, before he reaches the age of accountability, the prophecy is that Assyria would take over both Syria and Israel. And while they would not go all the way down and seize Judah, that was led by King Ahaz, or they would try it, their attempt would ultimately be thwarted. But it would still wreak havoc on Judah, and they would pay consequences for a long time to come. And then I'll go ahead and put this date on there. We're a long way from that. But eventually, in 586 BC, Jerusalem is going to fall, and they're going to fall to Babylon. So you can make that note as well. But we're a long way from that in this story. So that all happened last week. I mean, I taught it last week. It happened 3 millenniums ago. But just so I want to make sure I was clear. All right. For those fact checkers who want to point their finger, I wanted to clear that up. So what follows that now? That just kind of sets the context. What follows that is a series of prophecies, 4 of them total, and some other remarks that will kind of further lay out what God is planning to do. So let's go to chapter 8. It's kind of a fun text. It's pretty easy. This is pretty self-explanatory. As compared to last week, this is going to be a breeze, all right? Last week made us stretch a little bit. But I'm going to give you the literal contextual meaning, and then I hope I can make some application along the way to us. Although this doesn't lend itself in some places to that, I hope we'll be able to do that anyway. So we begin with chapter 8, verse 1. Moreover, the Lord said to me, and again, that's Isaiah talking. He said, take a large scroll and write on it with a man's pen, Meher Shalah Hash Baz, and I will make for myself faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz, for before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be taken away before the king of Assyria. So this is a pretty simple one. We're just going to walk through it. It is what it is, but let me just explain what it is. It is a public prophecy or a public oracle that God told Isaiah to make. It's not a private one when he was one-on-one with Ahaz. This is in front of everybody. And he is told to get a placard, Isaiah is, and to, with a large pen, write the words Maher Shalal Hashbaz, write it so that everybody can see. All right. So Isaiah, go out, get a whiteboard that's better than this, and a pen, and write it, and write that name on that for everyone to see. That name literally means speed the spoil and hasten the booty. Now, if I was talking to teenagers, I would have expected them to laugh, but you did as well. But that's what it means, literally. It means speed the spoil and hasten the booty. The booty is just the spoils, the gathering. And so that name, Maher Shalal Hash-baz, he was to write it. Everybody would read it and know that it means speed the spoil, hasten the booty. It combines the idea of doing something swiftly, speed it up, and with conquest, the spoil or the booty. So speed up, hurry up the conquest that will lead to the gathering of spoils. It was to emphasize that judgment was coming, and it was coming fast. All right, that's the whole point. Isaiah, write this in front of everybody, so everybody in 734 BC, when they see that, they're going to know God's serious, judgment is coming, and it's coming quickly. And then God said, I'll even give you a couple of witnesses to back it up. Verse 2, and there it was Uriah the priest and Zechariah. So you've got witnesses there that are going to see this as well. And so he does that. And then in verse 3, he then goes to the prophetess, and literally it's in this case his wife, and he goes to her, and this is talking about intimacy, and she conceives, and she bears a son. And guess what she calls? I mean, wouldn't you hate to be the wife of a prophet with a name like you had to name your kid that because it was the prophecy? But she named her child Maher-shalal Hash-baz, and before the child will have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be taken away before the king of Assyria. So she bears the son, and in so she becomes a bearer of the prophecy or the word of the Lord. For the child can talk, at least metaphorically. Syria, Damascus, Israel, Samaria would be overtaken. This was, let me just say this. A lot of times, Old Testament prophets, if you ever read Ezekiel or Jeremiah, God had them do some really strange things. And to kind of depict, kind of illustrate what he was going to do. I mean, actually, no worse, or no one had it worse than Hosea, who had to go out and marry a prostitute, and whose name was Gomer, to show Israel how God still loves them, even though they've been unfaithful to them. So this is kind of how Old Testament prophecy worked. They would often do these kind of picturesque things. And so he writes this on a placard, the name, she conceives, bears a child. They give that child that name, and and then that child, before that child really grows up, the fulfillment of the prophecy happens. Does that make sense to everybody? It's just kind of it's pretty simple story. It's odd. I'm not asking you to say, oh, that's makes perfect sense in my logic, but I want to make sure you understand what happened. That's what happened in this prophecy. So it's clear, and this is the point that I really want to make, that the Lord is in control of the events that are unfolding up here in the north. That's the bottom line. God's in charge. Here, remember, Ahaz has been shaking in his boots and wanting to make an alliance, and God said, I'll give you a sign, and he didn't take it. And God is saying, I'm in charge. And so write this down, and then she conceives and bears the child, and before the child grows to an age that is mature, the fulfillment of the prophecy indeed takes place. Again, it's clear that the Lord is in charge, and the events that are unfolding in the north are under his watch and his hand. So, like Ahaz, the reason this is written out is the people are given a chance to turn. It's like he's writing this out so the people of Israel and Judah can say, we're going to trust God. And so there is that opportunity. So it's not judgment yet to Judah, but it is warning that this is on the horizon. So as Isaiah prophesies this, he is telling Israel what's going to happen, and he's telling Judah what's going to happen, but you're next, so you need to learn to trust God. Judah's going to see this, and then they're going to watch their neighbor go down, and they're going to say God was telling the truth, which is going to give them a chance to say, when God speaks to us, we need to listen. But in their totality, Judah's not going to do it any better than Israel did it. They just have a few more years left before it falls on them. So I wrote this. It invites faith, but it doesn't force it or compel it. There is mystery here. The faithful would say, when they saw that, so we're next. Let's turn to God. Hopefully that's what we would do. If God prophetically spoke to us and said, this is what's going to happen to Israel, Syria and Israel are going to go down in the next few years, and we saw that happen, hopefully those of us who are faithful would say, then when God speaks to us, we're going to listen and obey. The faithless would assume that Ahaz was right in not forming an alliance with these two nations, and they would miss completely what God was about to do. So the people, like Ahaz, had a chance to turn, but like their king, they would not turn. Damascus would fall in 732, as I already wrote up here, and Samaria would fall in 722. So he prophesies, and then history tells us that that prophecy was indeed fulfilled just as he said it would be. Now, we move on to the second prophecy, beginning in verse 5. The Lord also spoke to me again, so it's the second one, saying, inasmuch as these people refuse the waters of Shiloh that flow softly, and they rejoice in Rezin and in Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up over them the waters of the river, strong and mighty, the king of Assyria and all of his glory. He will go up over all his channels. He will go over all his banks. He will pass through Judah. He will overflow and pass over. He will reach up to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Be shattered, O you people. Be broken in pieces. Give ear, all you from far countries. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak the word, but it will not stand, for God is with us. All right, so let's unpack. This is also is relatively simple when we understand the language. So Israel, which is in the north, has chosen to trust Syria and their alliance instead of God. Judah is leaning that way as well. So they have chosen to trust Rezin, who was the king of Damascus, and the one who allied with Pekah, who was the son of Remaliah, who was the king of Israel. You can find that in chapter 7 and verse 1. And they have chosen to trust those two kings and that alliance instead of, look at verse 6, instead of the waters of Shiloh that flow softly. The waters of Shiloh come from Jerusalem in the south. So that's a reference. Instead of trusting God who sits on the throne in Jerusalem, they have chosen to trust this alliance to defend them against the Assyrians. So again, let me make this real simple. God's people's problem was they were trusting human support, human politicians, human governments, human militaries to protect them rather than the God who said, you don't have to stress it because I'm going to keep someone from the throne of David or from the house of David on the throne. But they are nervous and they have chosen to trust these alliances instead of the waters that flow freely from Shiloh. That's from Jerusalem. Now remember, we'll play on words. Remember when Isaiah found Ahaz? He was out at the aqueduct looking at the fragile water supply. Remember that last week? And so God is saying, and what, just think about, let's just kind of put this in human terms. Ahaz is saying, as he looks at the aqueduct, well, how can we stand against the enemy that's coming? How can we make sure there's more water? How can we make sure that our infrastructure is going to keep us to stand against the enemy? Instead of saying, I trust the God who said he would take care of me. He's trying to figure it out in his human mind and planning, his strategic plan that he's written on the board. This is what's going to keep us, instead of simply saying, I'm going to trust the God who has promised that there will always be the line of David on the throne. So you see what's going on here. He's trusting human instrumentality as opposed to trusting God. So I think that's kind of a play on words. He was looking at the aqueduct, and now God says they've chosen to trust this alliance instead of the waters that flow freely from Jerusalem. And we talked about last week, water would be piped in, but if it was cut off by siege, devastation would occur. So to live inside of Jerusalem was to say you trusted God to provide for the needs that you had. But they had chosen military alliance and earthly kings over God's provision, and because of that, judgment would come. Then God says, now therefore, look at verse 7. Behold, the Lord brings up over them the waters of the river, strong and mighty, the king of Assyria in all of his glory. He's going to go up over the channels and go up over the banks. He's going to pass through Judah and overflow and pass over and reach up to the neck. So, like a flood, God said, because you did not trust the waters that flow from Shiloh, like a flood, he's going to let the Assyrians come in and they're going to flood the land. They're going to take over Syria. They're going to take over Israel. They're going to crush over the banks and over the borders, and it will not be turned around because it is under the control of God. Now, there are a few more years to come, and though God invites Judah to turn, Judah does not turn. There will be a remnant. We talked about that last week. They cannot be wholly destroyed because the Lord has spoken. But ultimately, they will be overrun. Now, everybody look right here for just a second. And we'll see some of these stories later on. I'm giving you the preview. Assyria is the power in the 700s. They are the world power. They are the Soviet Union of the day, when we had that world power thing going on. and they will take over completely Syria and Israel. And they will make some real dents in Judah. All right. They'll never overtake Jerusalem, but they will make dents in Judah. They will take some of the territory. By the time that Babylon takes over, Judah will not be as large as it once was because Assyria will have already violated its borders. Assyria will not be the final nail in the coffin. It will be Babylon down here, because by the time 586 BC comes around, the Babylonians will be greater than the Assyrians. They'll be the ones that will finish them off. But this kind of hacking away at Judah begins in the 700s. They're turning to idolatry. What's going to happen? Think about, if you've read Kings and Chronicles, think about the North always had bad kings. The South would have a bad king and then a good king. And they would have revival, and they would get some of their territory back, and then they would fall back into idolatry, and the Assyrians would beat in a little bit more. That went on for about 150 years, and finally they were so lukewarm that the Babylonians wiped them out. But this begins 150 years before the final nail is put in the coffin. But this is what's being prophesied about. Judah, do not make the same mistake that Israel is making. But ultimately, history tells us that Judah did make that same mistake. That kind of up to the neck phrase, where is that? In verse 8. He'll reach up to the neck. That is picturesque of, they're not going to completely drown in Assyria. They'll drown in Babylon later, but that's how much pressure Assyria is going to put on them because of their failure to trust God. So that is prophecy number 2. Look at verse 10. Take counsel together. You can talk about it, God says, but your counsel is going to come to nothing. Speak the word, but it will still not stand, for God is with us. In other words, you can try to talk God out of doing this, but God's already decided he's going to do it. And so you need to trust him, and they will miserably fail. Now, look at verse 11. This gets kind of interesting here in these next few verses. Verse 11. For the Lord spoke thus to me with a strong hand, and he instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people. Look at this. Who say, or I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, do not say a conspiracy concerning all this people, all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. He will be as a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel. Both the houses of Israel mean north and south, all right? As a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble. They shall fall and be broken, be snared and taken. Now, what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, I never thought I would end up talking about in a Bible study, but it's right here in Isaiah, and I'm kind of glad because I get to talk about it. Didn't know that I ever would. But there's an application or applications here as we move further this morning that are really, really important. So this prophecy is specifically for Isaiah. Look at verse 11. The Lord spoke to me and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of the people. So he's saying to Isaiah personally, Isaiah, don't you be like them. They've already done it. They've already made up their minds. Isaiah, you do not want to be like them. Everybody understand verse 11? It's just, Isaiah, don't be like Judah. All right? Isaiah and his followers are not to be like the people of Judah and Israel. And by the way, these are clearly disciples of Isaiah. You can look at verse 16, and he speaks to them, bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. So they had schools of prophets back. These are people that are with Isaiah. They are not to be like Judah. And verse 12, in what way are they not to be like Judah? This is really important. Please get this. They are not to be immersed in conspiracy theories. That's what it says. I didn't write that. Do not say a conspiracy concerning all that his people call a conspiracy. They apparently did. Yeah, the TikTok videos. Do not watch TikTok. No, watch this now. So they should not be afraid of threats that other people are saying or conspiracies. They need to fear and trust the Lord. Did you see that? Don't get caught up in, oh, I wonder if that's really happened. I wonder if that's, trust the Lord. He said that 700 years before Jesus was born. Don't get caught up in, it's the blame game, blaming somebody else or thinking somebody else is doing and getting all nervous about that. You say you trust the Lord, and yet you're worried about what somebody else can do to you instead of trusting the Lord. Everybody see how this would preach in 2026 really well? I mean, it would. They should not be afraid of the threats, but trust him. To those who trust him, he will be like a sanctuary. Look at that, verse 14. He'll be like a sanctuary, and he'll protect them, but he will be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. If you trust me, God said, I'll protect you. But if you keep believing that somebody else is in charge, then you're just going to stumble over me. You're going to find me to be a rock of offense instead of the sanctuary that I want to be for you. Those who do not trust him, verse 15, will stumble and they will fall. They'll be snared and they'll be taken. Now that leads us to verses 16 through 22, which is kind of a simple reflection on that. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait on the Lord who hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Here am I and the children whom the Lord has given me. We are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells in Mount Zion. And when they say to you, seek those who are mediums and wizards, who whisper and mutter, should not a people seek their God? Should they seek the dead on behalf of the living, to the law and to the testimony? If they do not speak according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. They will pass through it hard pressed and hungry. And it shall happen when they are hungry that they will be enraged and curse their king and their God and look upward. Then they will look to the earth and see trouble and darkness, gloom of anguish, and they will be driven into darkness. Really a pretty important section here. So Isaiah seems to be reflecting and speaking aloud to his own disciples. And he says, we need to bind up the word of God. We need to seal the testimony. And look at verse 17. Just look at that first phrase. And I will wait on the Lord. That's really important. Isaiah said, here, I've made my choice. I'm going to bind up the word of God. I'm going to seal the testimony. And I'm going to wait on the Lord. I have drawn my line in the sand. And I'm going to quit being unnerved by what some lesser power says they can do to me. And I'm going to stand on the side of the one who said he would be a sanctuary to me if I trusted him. This has powerful implications if we can get it. But those who reject God and his trustworthy faithfulness, verse 19 and 20, instead of doing what Isaiah and his disciples do, they're going to go to their mediums and their wizards. They're the people that whisper and mutter. They're going to seek the dead on behalf of the living. To the law and the testimony, if they do not speak according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. So those who reject God and his trustworthy faithfulness will actually, Isaiah said, turn to the occult. And in doing that, they further separate themselves from God. And the end of those, in verse 21 and 22, the end of those who reject the promise of the Lord, they're going to pass through it hard pressed and hungry. When they're hungry, they'll be enraged and they'll curse the king and their God and look upward. They'll look to the earth and they'll see trouble and darkness, gloom of anguish, and they will be driven into darkness. Now, I want you to see something here, and I will, it'll be toward the end, so just hang with me. And I know you're already making application in your head, but I'll make some pretty clear application at the end. But notice the clear line of demarcation between the faithless and the faithful. The faithful, in verse 17, I will wait on the Lord. The faithless, they will be enraged and they will curse their king and God. And the result of that, verse 22, will be darkness. There are three Hebrew words, trouble, darkness, gloom of anguish, and then even be driven into darkness. There's actually three different Hebrew words, darkness, gloom, and utter darkness, that are used here just to point out the depth of their depravity. They had loved darkness. They consulted mediums in dark rooms. Just think about where mediums are, in dark rooms and seances and candles. They loved darkness, and divine justice will give them what they loved. They consulted darkness, and they will end up in gloom and anguish and darkness. Very much what Jesus said in John 3:19. This is the condemnation. Light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. In other words, you get what you love. And if instead of going to the light and trusting and saying, I'm going to trust the God who is light and find him to be a sanctuary, you run to darkness to find an answer that suits you better, you'll end up, Isaiah said, you will end up getting what you loved. It's exactly what Judah will ultimately do. And then in chapter 9 and verse 1, there's another reflection. Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed. And when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan in Galilee of the Gentiles. This is really cool. Again, 700 years before Jesus. The nevertheless provides a segue into what is going to follow in verses 2 through 7. In verse 22, they go from gloom of anguish to chapter 9 and verse 1. Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed. Because of verse 17, Isaiah and his disciples have said, I will wait on the Lord. Those who trust in the Lord will not experience that gloom and anguish. As children of God, now here is maybe the first of my application, not the long set of them that I'll give you at the end. But as children of the Lord, we have a choice to make into which reality we're going to stand. There's gloom. We can choose to live in gloom and darkness because it's present. Or we can choose to do what Isaiah did. I will trust the name of the Lord. And to those, the gloom and darkness will pass away. Devastation will give way to glory. Chapter 9 and verse 1 is, it's a prophecy of the coming of Christ. Notice in verse 1, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Lightly esteemed and then oppressed, but glory would come to the remnant that would wait and trust. So we fast forward to Matthew chapter 4, right? 700 years later, and Matthew's writing, and he says, when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison he departed to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and he dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, and look, in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And upon those who sat in the region and the shadow of death, light is dawned. And from that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So let me scroll back for a minute. God is saying to Isaiah, he's much like he said to Ahaz, there may be some darkness for a while, but a virgin's going to conceive. And now he says to Isaiah, there's going to be gloom and anguish, but if you will hold by that testimony, verse 17, I will trust the name of the Lord my God, you will experience the glory rather than gloom and the anguish. Again, we have that choice. Unfortunately, there are Christians today that have chosen to stand in the gloom and anguish, chosen to be depressed about everything, and sky is falling, and I personally choose not to go there. I'm not really interested, and I believe that God's word is true, and I believe that God will fulfill what God has promised, and I believe that he's in control ultimately. And so I'm going to trust in the name of the Lord, and I'm not going to walk around discouraged and depressed, and things might get tough, but I'm going to find in him a sanctuary. The Bible says the name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous can run into it and find safety. So instead of trying to win the world to Christ by telling them how depressed I am, I think I will instead try to win the world to Christ by telling them ultimately how victorious Jesus is. Doesn't that make sense? We're not going to win a world if we're always looking and afraid. That's what God said to Judah. Quit thinking somebody else is in control. I'm in charge. I mean, it's like Isaiah is saying, do you all really think that the Assyrians and the whoever have come up with a conspiracy and God doesn't know it? I mean, there are actually Christians today that seem to act like that God somehow checked out and there were some conspiracies that were made that he didn't even know happened. How ridiculously foolish is that for somebody who says they are a child of God, right? That's true. All right. So anyway, this is a prophecy. At the end of the day, the Messiah is coming. Glory is coming. So, and even the promise of Acts 1:8 to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth, the message of the gospel would make it. Now, let's go to Oracle 4, verses 2 through 7. So this is the climax of this entire section, actually 7, 8, and 9 kind of ends here in this section. Verse 2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You multiplied the nation, you've increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff on his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and the garments rolled in blood be used for burning and fuel of fire. For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor. I'll talk about that in a minute. Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. This is the climax of the section. From darkness and gloom to light and glory. It's also a reversal of chapter 7, where Ahaz and the Davidic throne is challenged. Please work with me for just a moment. Remember, this section began with Ahaz thinking about making an alliance with Israel and Syria. Unbeknownst to him, they were planning on booting him, who is in the line of David, from the throne to put on the throne Tabeel, who was not in the line of David. So now the whole thing works through, and what does God announce? There is going to be somebody on the throne still 700 years later, and his name will be Emmanuel, God with us. He will be of the line of David. When we get to chapter 11, he's going to come out of the root of Jesse. So all of that Ahaz was nervous about, God is saying, you don't need to be nervous. 700 years later, you won't see it, Ahaz, but 700 years later, there's going to be a little maiden girl and her engaged, or the husband or the man that she's engaged to, that are going to be from the house of David, who are going to be called by Caesar Augustus. And he's going to say, you've got to come to Bethlehem to be taxed because you're of the line of David. And they're going to go, and she's really great with child, and it's going to be a bummer all the way, and they're not going to find any place to stay. But that child that Ahaz was afraid he was losing the throne back then, that child 700 years later is going to be born, so that Micah's prophecy in chapter 5 of Micah, that the child would be born in Bethlehem, could be fulfilled. So he's saying, now see, I can sympathize with Ahaz for struggling to believe because he hadn't seen it yet. But folks, we are without excuse. I mean, God fulfilled that precisely. And that's not just what the Bible says, that's what history says. And yet there are Christians that waffle and wonder whether or not this is true or not. It's nonsensical to go there. So anyway, he's going to fulfill that prophecy. What was once darkness and death is now light and life. And while we speak of a remnant, I want to say this. I thought this is an important statement to make. We do speak of a remnant, and the church world in general tends to swing on a pendulum all the time, and the remnant mentality leads many denominations and groups to think we're the only one. It's going to be a tiny little fraction. The Bible also says there will be a multitude that no man can number. So I think it's good for us to live in that tension of understanding that the remnant, I'll just say this because I'm Assemblies of God, the remnant is probably not just the people that got saved after 1914 when the Assemblies of God was formed, all right? Probably not. And whatever your faith tradition is, probably not your little group either, all right? There's a multitude that no man can number. Now, it's a remnant maybe in percentage to all that have ever lived, but let's live in the tension of that and not turn it into some egocentric, it's just us who believe this, and these four things that are going to make it. All who call on the name of Christ are going to be there. And I think all of us understand that. So I just thought I'd throw that in. We speak of a remnant, but we can't forget the New Testament promise of a multitude. So we need to hold that in tension and balance. Verse 5, their enemy is defeated. And it is the child that is born, the branch of chapter 4 and verse 2, the Emmanuel of chapter 7 and verse 14, and it will get to the root of Jesse in chapter 11 and verse 2. And, it sounds like 5 names, but literally in Hebrew, it's 4 names. Wonderful Counselor is really one name. And it literally is Wonder Counselor, or even more specifically, Supernatural Counselor. I often feel like I need supernatural counsel, right? I'm sure you do at times as well. So his name will be called Wonder Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Now, notice 4 names. This is just a little side note that I think is kind of cool. Look in chapter 8 and verse 1. It starts with, look at the names, Maher Shalal Hashbaz, four names, and that's a child. And so Barry Webb, very I think discerning when he says the outworking of God's plan in chapter 7 through 9 comes to the birth of children. Um, we have the four named Maher Shalal Hashbaz that is part of God's plan, and the ultimate part of God's plan is Wonder Counselor, Everlasting Father, um, Prince of Peace, Mighty God. And, um, and Webb says God really does demonstrate his power in weakness. I mean, think about that. The bookends of this story are a child that's going to be born to Isaiah's wife and a child that's going to be born of a virgin. And all of that to fulfill the plan of the God who spoke the world into existence. God does, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, demonstrate his power in weak things. Sometimes, I mean, here they are. Think about this. Think about this. They're afraid of this big, mighty army. And God uses two children born to make his plan come to fruition. So let me make some final observations, and you can choose to, I mean, of course, you can choose to agree or disagree, but I thought I would make you feel better if you choose to disagree by telling you can. All right. So there's just some final observations that I think we should take away from this. Number one, we need to embrace the reality of God at work in our lives. He's always at work. Does everybody believe he's always at work? All right. We love conspiracy theories, and I'm not. We all love to talk about these things, the Kennedy and the Kirk, and all of that. We love to talk about conspiracy theories because we prefer conspiracy theories to simple truth. It's a whole lot more fun, and it sells a whole lot more on the internet, and people buy the books. And I'm not saying none of them are true. Don't go to the other end of the continuum here. But we do prefer, well, it couldn't be that. It has to be something else. It has to be something underneath it all. Isaiah calls us to give up the conspiracy theories with what really happened and believe that God works in history and in our lives for our good, which happens to be what the Bible says. Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things, even those things we thought he didn't know because it was a conspiracy theory that somebody even pulled over the wool of God's eyes. And we know that he works all things together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed into the image of his son. God calls us to believe that. God calls us not to, have our knees rattling because we think the enemy's up to something that God doesn't know that he's up to, and we get all nervous. And what if the Antichrist swoops in this way and God is fooled and we're all doomed? I mean, I pastored for 41 years, and I have met a lot of people on Sunday morning after an earthquake or after an invasion by Israel who was sure this week was the week, and they were scared about it. Why would you be scared if this was the week Jesus was coming? I'm not sure. I'd be telling everybody I know instead of wanting to cower in a hole somewhere afraid. I'm sort of being sarcastic, but it's the truth. If it is, it is. But Jesus said he didn't know, and so if he didn't know, I don't know, and I just know what I'm supposed to do until it is. And I'm not going to be worried that there are these countries conspiring to bring in this Antichrist that fooled God. I just don't get that. I'm probably offending half of you, but I'm just telling you that's the truth. If we fear God, we don't need to fear anything else. If we trust him, we can trust him fully. I love these two paragraphs, and I'll make a few comments maybe to clean them up a little bit or make them make a little bit more sense. Because on first reading, I had to read it a few times to get everything out of it I needed to. But John Oswalt says this: many people in the West today have chosen to make God their stumbling block. We've accepted the dictum of reason triumphant, that there is nothing in life except the physical and material world. Let me just stop there for a moment. This is kind of a history lesson. But in the 17th century, late 1600s, that'd be the 17th century, all the way to the mid 1800s, historians call that the Enlightenment period, or some call it the Age of Reason. By the way, it was when our country was founded, during the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason came. It was a perfect storm, and I'm not an expert on this, but lots of things were happening. There were religious wars, for one, that made people say, well, there's going to be, if religions are going to fight, then this whole religion thing must be bogus. And scientific things happen, Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon and some of their discoveries. And what happened then is the world basically said, there can't be anything to this supernatural God thing. In general, that was what was happening in the world. Supernatural God thing. We are now too enlightened for that. We're reason needs to kick in. We just need to be reasonable and know there has to be some other explanation. I mean, Christians and Muslims are fighting, and the Catholics and the Protestants are fighting and killing people and burning Wycliffe at the stake for translating the Bible and all that stuff. So people were saying we've now become smart enough to realize this God thing can't be real because it's not working. That was the Enlightenment period, the Age of Reason. That would be reason triumphant as the dictum that there's nothing in life except the physical and the material. Never mind that reason is speaking outside its competency. We have accepted it. We may not feel like we're affected by it, but I promise you we are. We've attempted to jettison the realities of the spiritual world, get rid of them, and to function. And we say we believe in something else, but we function as if we were naked apes. We function as if God's not really in charge. Because we who say we believe in God get nervous every time we watch the news, like, oh, God can't take care of me. Okay? Are you all with me this morning? It's fun Wednesday morning, isn't it? All right. And then he goes on to say, but a strange thing has happened to us superior Westerners. We've discovered that the incredible physical and material wealth has not made us happier. It has not made us more contented people. Instead, we have found something still strangely missing. Well, wonder why. We were created to have a relationship with an eternal God. Of course, that something is God, but we have not turned back to that old-fashioned biblical God of our ancestors. No, we've turned to something much more modern and scientific, the horoscope, the occult, Mother Goddess, the earth, all of those things. AI. We are much too educated to believe in miracles. We swallow with alacrity the most amazing hodgepodge of superstition and paganism, and then we are surprised at the rapid increase of spiritual darkness all around us. God has become the stumbling block, and we are falling all over him. The only question is how far he will have to let us fall before we finally get the picture. We are doing the same thing they did in 700 BC. And again, this Kevin Holt, I could be wrong, but I think the reason we want to believe in anything else other than a God is because if there really is a God that did this, we have to surrender to him. All right? That if there's somebody greater than me, then I have to submit to him. And that's why our world will do somersaults to try to get away from it. It has to be something else. We've been trying the Age of Reason, mysticism, the occult, all this stuff. Now we're dealing with the 1 John 2 stuff that we talked about Sunday morning. We're loving the world and the things that are in the world, something to satisfy. But until we recognize that the only thing that will satisfy is the Lordship of Jesus Christ, but that Lordship of Jesus Christ means we have to allow him to be Lord in our lives, we'll not find that satisfaction met. So God is with us, Emmanuel. He's inescapably present in our lives. If this were a demon or a monster, we would be horrifically afraid. Even if he were a just God who could not be placated, we would have reason for fear and angst. But the God who is with us wants to and can turn our darkness into light. But how can a transcendent God be with us? Metaphorically, the gulf is too great to pass over a perfect God and sinful humanity. How can God be with us through the greatest event in the history of the world, the incarnation, a child born of a virgin? And the government shall be upon his shoulders. And the question we all have to ask is, does he govern my life? The government, see, the government, I can't explain world affairs except there's a broken humanity that it's broken. But I can tell you, God today is not nervous on his throne. He is not, and he is not. He is not beholden to, I don't know who the next supreme leader is, but he's not beholden to the next supreme leader. He's not beholden to Donald Trump. He's not beholden to Benjamin Netanyahu. God is in charge, and we can trust that God is in charge. The key is, will we really let him be in charge of our lives?